All right. I am going to get this started. I am on the road. So here goes. A lot of people can catch this on the replay, which is what I normally get when I do live streams. So let's just jump right into this. A lot of people always ask, how do you start a podcast? What do I need to start a podcast? If I have a business, should I start a podcast? And a lot of people offer good information about doing a podcast. But one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the information is really generic. And there's a lot of things that people should sort of pre-do before they actually get into doing a podcast. So what I want to do is just kind of start from the beginning, give you step one all the way through. And I want to tell you some of the mistakes that I made in the process of creating my podcast. When I first started my podcast, there was a lot of things I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't do some of the research that I should have did. I watched some videos on people doing podcasts, but one of the things that I didn't do was actually to do due diligence myself for exactly what my podcast was going to be about. Every podcast is going to be different. And I was getting into the mindset of trying to compare my podcast with other people's podcasts. And I quickly learned out of some hard lessons that topics that other people were passionate about, I wasn't passionate about. And there were just certain areas of podcasting that I did not want to go in. So I want to tell you about my mistakes. I want to tell you what I did wrong. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast, if you're in the process of starting a podcast, I think this is going to be helpful to you. So if you have questions, please ask. But also keep in mind, I want to tell you that the reason I want to do this is because I see a lot of people say, I want to start a podcast. And they will start a podcast. And then after some people, 2 months, 3 months, the podcast is gone. So they spent money trying to invest in equipment to do a podcast, and they're gone after 3 months. I've seen a lot of people jump on the podcast train, and then all of a sudden they disappear. So I want to help you understand why that happens and how you can prevent that from happening. First, let's start with the people that's saying, I want to start a podcast. Okay. First thing first, and this was my first mistake. If you're going to start a podcast, take a look at your social media, your Instagram, your Facebook, your Twitter accounts. And this is important because this is how you're going to actually generate your following. My mistake was I wasn't active on social media. I didn't have a following. So for me to come out with my genre, which mine is self-improvement, if I was smart, going back now, what I would have done is the second I thought like, hey, I want to start a podcast. And once I figured out what I wanted my podcast to be about, I would have started creating a social media platform around that. I would have had an Instagram page on self-improvement, a Twitter account on self-improvement, Facebook on self-improvement. And the reason I say that is once you create that sort of branding for yourself and you become kind of known and you start building followers around the fact that you're the person that's into self-improvement, you're the person that's into music, you're the person that's into sports, politics, whatever you want to make your podcast about, be it strip clubs, be it drama, be it reality TV shows, if you market your social media account so that that is what you're pushing, people are going to start to follow you based on that. And you're going to start to build sort of like a little following for yourself. Then when you start to come out with your podcast, those followers will transition over to your podcast because now they already know you for that specific niche. My mistake was I didn't do that. So now my podcast is taking off, but it took longer than it should have because I didn't take the time to set up my social media to sort of be a pre-introduction to my podcast. So people are now just finding out like, oh, the Simply Straight Talk, it's a great podcast. So now every week I got steady numbers and they're steady going up. But it could have happened sooner if I would have created my social media platform to where it was built around what my podcast was going to be about. And I'm telling you this first because a lot of people, first thing they do, they go out, they buy some mics, they go out and they buy equalizer, they buy all this stuff, and they don't even know what they're going to talk about. They don't even know what their podcast is going to be about. They just figure they're going to get up and just do a podcast and it's going to be a hit. That is not the case. Not at all. Now, I already told you that you need to try to figure out what your niche is going to be. What are you going to talk about? What is your podcast show going to be about? That's the first thing you need to do. Find out, and sort of test yourself. What topics really interest you? What is it that you can actually put out that you're going to enjoy discussions, enjoy engaging with other people about? So that's the first thing. Figure out what is your podcast going to be about, and then start setting up your social media around that. That's the first thing. The next thing you need to figure out, now this is for people right now, this first part for people who are trying to start a podcast. The next thing you need to figure out is how many podcast shows are you going to do? I do one podcast show a week. So every Friday I drop a new episode. Now, that's important to know because with podcasting, you have to have a host, which would be Libsyn, Anchor, Stitcher, Podbean. So there are different hosting platforms, and you're going to need to select one. Now, I'm going to get into that. But for right now, I just want you to kind of focus on the fact that, if you're setting up your podcast, you got to be mindful of, like I said, your social media, which is going to start bringing followers. You sort of branding yourself. Then, what's the name of your podcast? What are you going to call your podcast? One of the mistakes I did, I selected the Simply Straight Talk Show. Now, I like the name of my podcast, but here's where it sort of hit me in a good way and a bad way. And I'm telling you this because a lot of podcasters make this mistake. I chose Simply Straight Talk. Now, many of you probably know that there is a cell phone company called Simply Straight Talk. Well, it's called Straight Talk. I'm Simply Straight Talk. They are Straight Talk. So I am battling with a major corporation when it comes to websites and internet presence because they are a Fortune 500 company. So it's going to be hard for little old me to compete against them with their massive, web team that they have for their website. So they have a greater web presence. So after about 1-2 pages, I pop up, but they dominate the first page. And I think they know that because they've increased their presence because I was starting to creep in. But it's hard for me as one person to contend with that. So when you pick a name for your podcast, make sure you pick a name that is not competing against a major company. You know what I'm saying? So you got to think about that. Like you got T-Mobile. If you pick G-Mobile, well, guess what? You're going to be competing against T-Mobile. Even though you change one word, you still got to remember that that bigger company is going to have the bigger presence on the internet. So when people search, they might pop up more so than you will, especially in the beginning. Pick a name that's relevant to your podcast and what you're going to be discussing. So when people see the name of your podcast, it should automatically reflect on what your podcast is about. They need to coincide with each other. The name of your podcast, what your podcast is about, your topics, your discussion, it should be relatable. So people get an idea because it's a way of kind of playing with people's minds. It's a good marketing trick, actually, that when people see it, they automatically associate it with you. Now, we talked about setting up your social media. We talked about a name. We talked about, setting up your niche. What are you going to talk about? What's your topics? Now, you want to be careful that you don't get into a topic that nobody wants to hear. That's the key thing. You're going to have to find out, is your topic something that is relatable to many people, something that people are looking to hear about, they want to know about. You know, like some people do random topics. Okay. So if you know that technology is a big thing and you're into technology, choose technology, performing arts, comedy. You know, you got to pay attention to what's trending and find something that's you can relate to, something that you're passionate about. Because when you start getting followers and you start getting questions and you start getting people engaging, they're going to be on you. So you want to pick a topic that you can relate to, but you want to make sure that it's a discussion that you are willing to engage in. You want to engage in it with your audience. So pick your discussions carefully in regarding to your topics. So make sure it's something that you are passionate about and you know there's a market out there for it, that people want to hear about it. And that's important because that's going to determine the success of your podcast, because that's also how you have to kind of push your social media as well. You know, if your podcast is about technology, if your podcast is about photography, it absolutely makes no sense at all to do all of your tags in your social media to people who are interested in politics, to people who are interested in flowers. You need to stick to your technology group because those are the people that's going to come to you. Those are the people that's going to be looking for what you're putting out. Whereas people who are interested in flowers, people who are interested in food, you know, they're not really going to be so interested in what you're doing. You may get some that like, but they're not going to be actively engaging. Because here's the thing. You want to find an organic following, people who are interested in what you're saying and in what you're putting out. Okay? You want to get that because those are the people that's going to stick with you and they're going to support you. Now, let's get into podcasting itself. One of the things that I tell people that when you're going to start a podcast is everybody's concerned about the equipment. Like, what equipment do I need? Some people go out and they buy $400 and $500 microphones. You know, they buy big equalizers. You don't need all of that, especially if you're just starting out. I use the Blue Yeti microphone, which I should be able to put it. This is the Blue Yeti. Okay. That's the Blue Yeti. The Blue Yeti will run you probably about 129, 140. Very good microphone. It is used by a lot of podcasters. Great sound. It is USB, which means it plugs right into your computer. Where if you want to go and get the other microphones where you're going to have to need a plug-in, which will be an equalizer, you got to play with your sound. That's when you're doing, say, more than one or two people. When you're doing like 2 or 3 or 4, I say 4 people, then you want to get that. Because now you're dealing with something that's a little bit more intricate and it's going to take a little bit more to set up. So be mindful that if you are just starting out and it's just you and one other person, I would recommend the Blue Yeti. I have been using it for 4 years now. It is a great microphone. I've had no problems. The sound is good. It picks up great sound. It's got 4 audios on the back, so you can choose stereo, mono, you can choose all that. But you don't have to go expensive. I would say to start out, if you have a laptop for that you're going to use, you're going to probably end up paying with a microphone, which is probably the biggest thing you can get. The microphone is about like I said, 129, 140. The filter you saw, the sound filter, is going to run you probably about 30, 40. And then the other filter you saw is going to run you probably about 15 to 20 bucks. You can probably get them cheaper on Amazon or something like that. So the equipment is not expensive. It's just the fact that if you're going to do podcasting, you want to make sure that you're actually going to stick with it. I mean, even though that sounds like a small amount of money, because let's say $230 if you have your own laptop and it has a USB and a webcam. We will get into that later. But if it has a USB, that's all you need. Honestly, you're really only going to spend about $230 and you're all set. Spending $500 to $1,000 and you're just starting out, I really don't recommend that. And some people will. They go out and buy the Rode microphones, they buy the top of the line equalizers, and they're buying all this stuff. And if it don't work out, then you're stuck with all this equipment. So that's why I say the Yeti microphone is a good one to start out with. You buy your pop filter, you buy your sound filter, you're looking about $220, $240 for your equipment. That's if you have your own laptop. If you don't have a laptop, then of course you need to go out and buy a laptop. You don't need some fancy $3,000 to $4,000 laptop to do it. You really don't. The laptop I'm using right now only cost about, I think it was like $230. No, it was like $300. It's perfect for what I need. So that's pretty much the equipment you're going to need as far as what you're going to be physically using. A laptop, pop filter, your microphone, your soundboard, and that's it. Don't go out and overspend, especially when you're first starting out. Do not, because you are really going to regret it if you decide that this is something that you don't like and don't want to do. Next, I want to tell you about hosting, because that's a big thing. Now, I use Libsyn, and I personally prefer Libsyn. Like I said, everything I'm telling y'all, this is me from my experience. I'm not getting compensated. I'm not sponsoring anybody. Nobody's sponsoring me. This is me trying to help people out because I get asked these questions a lot. I use Libsyn because Libsyn, it automatically pushes my stuff to Apple. It pushes my stuff to Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play. All I have to do is upload it one time. And once I upload it, they take care of the rest. They do the rest. And that's what I like, because once you upload your podcast, you want a hosting site that's going to push your podcast out there. Now, like I said, some people use Anchor, some people use Stitcher, some people use, I think it's like Podbean, Beansprout. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people use Anchor because it's free. But I see a lot of people also saying after about about 8 months to a year, it's like, okay, I'm done with Anchor. I need to move somewhere else, because you have to actually run promos for Anchor on your podcast. Whereas Libsyn, I don't have to run promos for them at all. It's all my content. I own everything. And another thing you want to look at too, with some hosting platforms, when you upload stuff, you only get so much a month. So with Anchor and some of these other ones, your stuff will go into an archive. Whereas with Libsyn, you can go back and hear my very first podcast. And I have, I think, like 140, 150 podcasts up right now, shows up. So that's one of the things you want to consider too. How much data storage are you getting with your hosting platform? With Libsyn, I pay $20 a month. Now, they have other plans. I think one is $15 and one is $5. I chose the $20 a month because with that one, I have the option of creating an app for my show if I want to. But my shows run, we're going to say an hour. So with 4 shows, with a show each week, an hour-long show, I still have so much data left. I can actually do 8 shows a month and still have enough data with Libsyn to run my shows. So that's why I like Libsyn, because I like the fact that I have that option to add more shows if I want. I can do bonus shows if I want, and I don't have to really worry about my data running out and the fact that, I can't do any more shows. And that's something you got to consider when you're choosing a hosting platform, is how much data storage and how often are you going to push your podcast. One of the mistakes I see a lot of new podcasters do is when they come in they'll do a show 1 week and then they won't do a show for another 2 weeks. Some people do a show once a month. Inconsistency will kill you in podcasting. If you start to develop an audience and they start to realize they don't know when you're going to publish a show, then they're going to drift away from you and they're just going to find somebody else who's consistent. Now, when we talk about publishing a podcast, once you select your hosting platform, whichever one you choose, like I said, I like Libsyn because for me, it's just simple. And once I upload it, they do all the work. I can just go back and check. Yep, I'm on Apple. Yes, I'm on iTunes. Yes, I'm on Spotify. Yes, I'm on iHeartRadio. I'm on Radio One. I'm on Google Play. I know where my podcast is going. And also, when new avenues come that want to push podcasts out there, Libsyn will send you an email saying, hey, we got this new platform that wants to add podcasts. Would you like to add yours? You say yes, boom, it's gone. They're going to put it out there. So that's how I got my podcast to be more international and not just domestic in the United States, because I took advantage of some of the other things they was offering from other platforms, and it didn't cost me a dime. Like I said, I pay $20 a month. I want to be honest and upfront about this whole podcasting thing. Next, I was telling y'all about consistency. You need to determine how often are you going to drop your podcast. And you need to be consistent with that. Because if you don't, like I said, you're going to lose followers. Now, in order to do this, I think people don't understand how much work goes into doing a podcast, especially if you want your podcast to sound professional. You want your podcast to sound like you actually care about what you're putting out. When I first did my podcast, hey, thank you, Gamble. When I first did my podcast, it sounds so different than what you hear now. If you listen to the very first show I did, I listen to it now and I think like, man, that was crap. But back then I thought it was good. So you cannot be afraid when you're first starting out to kind of test the waters. Like, how are you setting up your podcast? Does it sound good? Do you like your intro? You know, is it a good transition? Are you going to have like little commercial breaks in your podcast? Or are you just going to keep talking and going through and through and through? Because the problem I hear with people who have a nonstop, just 1 hour, or some people have 2-hour podcasts where they're just talking, you hear them talk, or they just start laughing. You don't know what they're talking about, or you hear this. And you're wondering if they're still there because they don't have a proper format. So before you put out your podcast, I really recommend that you create a format. Now, for my podcast, there's a intro song, which I purchased on Fiverr, where basically I had this guy create a jazz tune. I wrote the lyrics for it. Then found a singer. She charged me $40 to sing the song. And then it goes from an intro song. Then it goes to this little comedy skit that I do that sort of introduces the topic of the day. Then there's a like show introduction, and then the actual show starts. The first part of the show is 15 minutes. Then I take like a little break. So that's like 5 minutes, like a quick commercial. Then it comes back to the second half of the show, which is 10 minutes. Then the final thoughts of the show, which is 5 minutes. Then there's an outro thanking everybody for listening or inviting everybody to join. And then there's an outro song. So I wanted mine to sound professional. Now, you don't have to do all that. I wanted mine to sound like when people hear it, like, wow, this is good. Like, he cares. He put some effort into this. So that is why you need to come up with a format and actually maybe create show notes, because a lot of people, they just hop on, they grab their microphone and they sit down, they hit record, and they just going. They're just going. And then it's like the conversation is all over the place. And half the time they lose track of what they're talking about. And the listener is like, okay, I'm confused. And nobody wants to listen to an audio that they don't know what's going on. So next we're getting into, how do you record your podcast? If you're going to record your podcast, you can use Audacity, which is a very popular platform. It's absolutely free. Then with Audacity, you simply just plug it in. You open up the Audacity. You can do it on your computer. You open up Audacity, and once you start your podcast where you're actually recording, it records everything in there. And then you can make adjustments to your sound as needed. You can add music. That's a whole nother conversation, because you know, you can add music, you can actually go through and cut out gaps. And that's why I say podcasting is not just hopping on a microphone and just keep talking. It really is about making sure your stuff sounds professional. And Audacity is what I use, because with me, I like the fact that I can go back. If there's noises in the background, I can, sort of take out the background noise, which it does a good job of that. So I can take out like an air conditioner or a heater going, fans, cars. I can take all of that out so I have a clean background. I can raise and lower the volume. You can do all the compressions, and you can do fade ins and fade outs. You can add music to it, and that you select and copy in there. So Audacity is a good form. So real quick, just to go over the tools that we use so far. We talked about your microphone. We talked about your pop filter. We talked about having a computer. And we just mentioned Audacity is what I use for recording. Now, people use different things. Some people use another tool called GarageBand. Now, there are other things out there you can use, like Studio 3. These are things that's going to kind of cost you. So if you want, to go high end, I would, like I said, I don't recommend, I'm not knocking the high end stuff. But I'm just saying, don't spend hundreds of dollars with not being sure that you're going to do podcasting long enough to recover it, because a lot of people do that. You spend all this money, and now you're stuck with this stuff and you can't use it. So there's Studio 3, there's GarageBand, but Audacity is free. It's a good tool to use. So I do recommend that if you are going to record your podcast, you can use Audacity. You can even have somebody else record, and you can put the conversations together, But like I said, that's a whole nother video. But Audacity is free and it's good to use. Next is, should you have a co-host? Now, here's the thing about co-hosting. I do my podcast by myself. I would like to have a co-host. But finding a co-host means finding somebody that can help you push the conversation along. Somebody who's willing to work with you and not just sit back and just say, hey, I was on their podcast. Because like I said, podcasting takes work, because it's coming up with your topics, is putting your show notes together, is making sure that your sound quality is good, that when people hear your podcast, it sounds good. Is making sure that you're engaging your audience, you're engaging your listeners, that people are not just tuning into your podcast for like 10 or 15 seconds and say, I don't want to hear this, and turning it off. That's why you got to be on point with your conversations to make sure that you got those trigger words that make a person say, whoa, let me listen to this. Let me hear what they're saying. Now, that's why I say, so if you're going to get a co-host, you got to make sure it's somebody that's going to help push the show along, because you'll see a lot of people that start off with co-hosts and then end up either giving up the podcast, or they simply move out, or they just stop the podcast altogether. So be careful if you go to co-host. I'm not saying be careful about working with people. I agree with that. But just make sure you choose somebody that you guys are on the same mindset regarding how the podcast is going to work and what are you trying to get out of it. Now, when you're doing a podcast, we talked about it. You got to select the name. One thing I tell people to do, and I don't understand for the life of me, that if you're going to be serious about doing this podcast, you want to get your podcast show name, go ahead and pay for it as a domain. And the reason I say that is because, like, let's take the name Unapologetic. If you Google Unapologetic, there are hundreds of unapologetic shows out there. And it's going to be so hard for people to pick you. So you want to make sure that by picking a domain name and owning that domain, which is going to cost you like what? If you use Namecheap, that's who I like, or your hosting platform. Sometimes they'll give you one. If you got a podcast, I highly recommend that you get a domain name using the name of your podcast. And I say that because you want your podcast to show up. You want your podcast to be something that people are going to be able to find easily. What's up, Harris? You want your podcast to be something that people can find. And when you take something like, Unapologetic, that has like 50 people with the same name, people are going to have a hard time finding you. And when people can't find you, you know what they do? They go somewhere else. Get the domain name. That way, even if you decide to get a one web page with your podcast name, you're already getting ahead of everybody else. The longer you keep your podcast name open and it's not a domain name, that means you can have a successful podcast that's blowing up. You're getting 10,000 downloads a day. If your name is not if you don't own the domain name for it, somebody else can come and buy that name. And guess what? They can redirect all that traffic to whatever they're doing. So anybody who's keying in your name will be going to whatever product or service they're doing, or even if they start a podcast and they take the name that you have, there's nothing you can do. You're now just promoting more people for them, because people, when they search, they're the ones that's going to pop up. So keep in mind that when you're doing a podcast, you need to be mindful of your name. Get a domain name. It's $7 to anywhere like $13 a year. It's so worth it. Now, we talked about hosting. You got to have a hosting platform to get your podcast out there. Now, if you want your podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, there is normally a 3-month waiting period. And that's because they want to make sure that you are legitimate. And that's why when you join even Libsyn, any platform, if you say, yeah, I want to get my stuff on Apple, it's like, okay, because you can't go directly to Apple and you can't go directly to Spotify and just upload your stuff. It has to be through one of the hosting platforms. And there's a 3-month period. There you go. 3-month waiting period. And that's just to make sure that you're legitimate. Even with iHeartRadio, there's a waiting period because they want to make sure that your podcast is still going to be going, because like I said, a lot of podcasts disappear after 3 months. A lot of people simply don't realize how hard it is. Well, how much work. It's not hard. It's how much work it takes putting together a podcast so it sounds professional. The conversations and discussions are engaging. You know what I'm saying? Then that brings me to the next thing, your cover art. When you want to upload your podcast to any hosting platform, Apple or Spotify, you have to get your cover art done. I got my cover art done through on Fiverr. I found someone on Fiverr that did it for me. Actually, a really cool guy, because he's made several adjustments. This, at first, every season I was paying to have a new cover art done for my podcast. But then I started to think like, man, why am I doing this? Because I was doing a new cover season 1, new cover season 2. Like I'm 9 seasons in right now. Then I realized, why don't I just keep one cover art and let that just be the branding for the podcast? So find you one good cover art. You don't need to change it out like I was doing. It's a real waste of money, because you're going to spend anywhere from $20 to $40 on custom cover art. And if you're doing that every season, it don't sound like much, but it starts to add up. Because also, when I record my podcast, I send my podcast to be edited. So there's another guy, like I said, I found on Fiverr. He does my post editing, which is making sure that everything sounds good, The levels are balanced. And he also gives me tips back. Like when I send him a recording, he'll tell me, hey, you might want to turn your recording volume down when you're speaking. You might want to adjust your mic. So it's things like that that makes a difference. And that costs $20 a month. Well, $20, I'm sorry, $20 an episode. Every time I send a podcast to him, that's $20. So that's $80 a month I spend on someone who's a little more professional and knowledgeable about the final editing to do it, because I want my podcast to sound good. And you should too. You should want your podcast to sound good. You should want your podcast to be engaging. Now, we talked about the equipment. We talked about the hosting platforms. We talked about you getting a name. We talked about getting a domain name for your podcast. We talked about some of the work, that comes with it. That means recording, conversation, show notes. You know what I'm saying? Recording your audio. You can use Audacity. You can use GarageBand. You can use Studio 3. It depends if you want to pay the money. But like I said, Audacity is free. They just ask that you sort of contribute $5 or $1 to them whenever you can to help them keep it free. So the key things with starting a podcast is making sure that first you want to do it. So before you buy any equipment, make sure that you understand that you have something that you want to talk about, something that you want to share. Now, one thing people got to consider about in podcasting is music. Can I add music to my podcast from celebrities or popular music, mainstream music? Here's the thing. If you don't have permission to use their music, your podcast will get blocked and taken down. Now, and some people say, well, I contacted the representative and the representative said I can use it, because I actually had this situation to where I was reaching out to certain celebrities saying, hey, I want to use your music because I want to do a spot on your last album. Sometimes the artist doesn't own it. The record label does. Even if the artist say, yeah, go for it, you can use it, the record label can say, no. And they will take your stuff down. Sometimes their publicist or their agent will give you authorization to use it, and they don't have authorization. So I try to stay away from any mainstream music. So if you're thinking about using Beyonce or Drake or, any of those people to, play their music in the background, I highly advise that you do not do it, because they will flag your stuff and it'll get taken down. And you don't want to have that happen. And they will do it quickly. So be careful about using music. YouTube has music that you can download. There's a what is the one I use? Jungle Audio. They have some music tracks that you can buy. Some of them cost $1. Some of them cost $20, $30. It just depends on the song, what you're looking for. So I've used them because I have one like a hip hop beat that I use when I close out the first part and the second part. It kind of lets you know, like, okay, he's getting ready to go to a break when you hear that come in. So, and I think I paid like $7. So there is money involved in this, and it's not necessarily all free. So, but it's not expensive. Like those are just kind of like one-time things. Once you buy the license to use it commercially, you're good. You don't have to buy it anymore. But be careful about using music, and be careful about using mainstream music specifically, because it will get your stuff shut down and taken down from all digital platforms. The next question I get is how can I make money on podcasting? Now, this is a big thing, because to be honest with you, you're not going to see money in podcasting until you hit big numbers. When you hit big numbers, then you're going to see people saying, hey, can you sponsor this? Can you do this? And, like I said, it's going to be big numbers. You gotta have those big numbers, because if anybody's gonna pay you to sponsor their stuff, they're gonna want to know that your podcast is reaching a wide audience. So if you're not getting a huge audience, most likely you're not gonna get sponsors. Now, you can reach out to people and ask, hey, and say, hey, I have a podcast. Would you mind, being a sponsor of my podcast? Some people may say yes, and these are people who are probably very small business owners. But the bigger places are going to ask questions like, "Well, what's your audience numbers? How many listeners do you get a week? What is your?" They're going to want the numbers. What's your target audience? How many listeners are you getting? How many downloads are you getting per week, per day, per month? How long have you been podcasting? And what is your podcasting niche? What is your topic? What is your genre? This is where a lot of people run into problems when they're starting to get sponsors. Because if you have a podcast, now, like I said, I understand people do podcasts because they want to be able to feel like they can speak freely. They can say whatever they want to say. But if you're looking for sponsors, you need to be mindful of the content and what you say. Now, I'm not saying you got to hold back on how you feel, be it politics, be it society and culture issues, you're dealing with racism. But if you're doing a podcast and it's all vulgar, it's all sexual, keep in mind that you may get a big audience. I'm going to get into that. But some people who own businesses who may want to sponsor a podcast may feel like you're not the right fit for them. Whereas your podcast is about sex all the time, you may get adult stores who feel like, okay, you're a good fit for us. You talk about sex. But do you talk about sex in a way that's relationship-wise, sex in a way that people can kind of learn? Or are you just talking about how many women you can bang or how many men she can do? You know what I'm saying? Is how you are putting your conversations together that makes the organization say, okay, we can sponsor them. And the thing about a company sponsoring you is the fact that, or they're saying we're going to pay you to promote our product, is they're going to expect a certain quality. And don't think they're not listening, because the first time you say something crazy, they're going to pull their sponsorship from you. And that's normally in the agreement. If you're not maintaining certain guidelines, they will pull that sponsorship from you. So keep that in mind as well for people out there looking for sponsors. Another big question is, how do you get audience? How do you get an audience? How do you get listeners? Here's the thing. With podcasting, number one, consistency. Number two, your conversation topics, and you got to promote. And that's why I said in the beginning of this live stream that before you start doing your actual podcast where you got it on the hosting site and they're putting it out there, you need to make sure that you're using your social media to build up your name in that area. Like I said, if your self-improvement podcast is that's what you're going to have, do a self-improvement social media. If you're going to do a technology podcast, then have technology social media. Separate your personal from your podcast. What's going to be your podcast social media? And your podcast social media, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it needs to be named after your podcast. Whatever your podcast name is, that's what you need to call your social media. So you got your personal page, and then you got your podcast social media branding. And all of that should be marketing towards whatever you're trying to push. If you want a poetry podcast, then have poetry social media sites. Start building people to where they're following you and liking what you're posting. Then it's so much easier to transition them over. That's part of the whole marketing process. The next thing you can do is create audiograms, which I highly recommend. Now, Headliner is one of the most popular tools used to create audiograms. Another tool you can use is Filmora. Now, with audiogram, it's a little bit simpler. And basically, you can just record audio, or you can take audio from the clip, upload it to audiogram, And then you can do a 1 minute clip for Instagram. I think it's like a minute and a half or 2 minutes and 20 seconds for Twitter. And then you can do up to 10 minutes, on Facebook. But you can upload these clips to audiogram, and then you can use the little templates to create it. And you got the little, what you call that? The little beat thing that kind of shows when you're talking. You can also add, what you call those? Closed captions. Now, that's with Headliner. Now, if you don't pay for Headliner and you use the free version, you get 10 a month. That's what you get. 10 a month. After you use your 10, that's it. You have to wait until the next month for it to start over again. So I do 4 shows a month. Yeah, 4 a month or 5, depending on the month. And then, so that means I don't really use all of them. But you get 10 a month. That's it. But other than that, I think if you pay for it, it's like $29 or $40 a month, something like that. So, but I use the free version because that's enough for me. But using audiograms, you're basically giving people a little snippet of what your show is going to be about, and you post that on social media, Facebook, and Twitter. That helps with the advertising and marketing of your show, because when people hear it, it's like, oh, that's what you're going to be talking about. But you just have to understand that you want to pick a section of your clip for your audiogram through Headliner that when people hear it is going to pique their interest. I normally try to select a part of my audio clip from the show that's going to sort of ask a question about what the show is about. It's going to start giving information, but it kind of makes people say, wait a minute, what was he going to say after that? You want to make it where it draws them to the show. So they want to hear what is the rest of the thing that you're trying to say. So using Headliner is a good way to promote your show. Another thing is a lot of people join these Facebook groups. Like, I'm not going to call any names because they may not like what I'm about to say. But a lot of people join podcast groups. I have joined a few on Facebook. My only issue with some of the Facebook groups as trying to market is everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's posting their information about their show. Everybody's posting, go and like my podcast. Go on Apple and like my podcast. Everybody's doing that. And the thing about it is they're all podcasters trying to do the same thing you're doing, which is growing their show. Now, it is good to be a part of that because you can ask questions. If you got a question about starting a podcast, if you got a question about, what should you use or what should you do, people will normally respond back. But it's not a great tool for actually growing your audience. It's really not. Most of that is going to come from you actually getting on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook and actually pushing your podcast out there. What are your topics? Whatever you're going to be speaking about, like I said, if it's technology, do a technology post, something about technology, something about poetry, something about self-help, something about business. If you got a business podcast that does business tips, you want to push that out there as well. Now, some people say, another question I get is, if I have a business, should I start a podcast? Well, here's the thing. If you have a business and you want to start a podcast, I think you really need to consider. I would consider more teaming up with somebody that has a podcast. That's what I would do. Like if you got a restaurant and you want to be a part of a podcast, I would consider teaming up with somebody who has a food podcast. That's what I would do because they have the audience, they're already doing it, and you're sort of getting free marketing, free promotions. And then once you get a feel for what they're doing, then you can determine like, okay, let me see if I can do my own podcast. But keep in mind, you're now talking time because you got to realize something. My intro skit, when I record the intro skits with Angelique and Melissa, the 2 voiceover artists, those skits are anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes long. For me to edit those skits takes up to maybe an hour, hour and a half to put ball the voices together, put the backgrounds in, the sounds, and all that type of stuff. So you got to consider the time that it takes to actually do the editing of your podcast. Like I said, podcasting is not simply you just sit down in front of a microphone and go at it. It really is some creative work that has to take place to make people want to listen and want to be a part of your podcast. So you got to be mindful about that, because when you're creating a podcast, you want to create something that's going to make you feel good, because this is your voice. You're basically putting your voice, your thoughts, your mental imprint is now being verbalized to everybody that can hear it. So when you're doing a podcast, you want to make sure that you're going down the right lane. One of the other questions I get about podcasting is, when should I actually start posting my podcast? I tell people that record up to 6 shows, no less than 6. Record up to 6 shows, and you post them over 2 weeks. Once you do that, then you start announcing. And I'm going to tell you why I say that. Because a lot of people, when they see a podcast and when they go to a person's page and they see one podcast, they're normally like, okay. I don't think they're going to be here. But when they see a person with 6 to 10 podcasts, and let's say the podcast, like I said, my actual podcast is 30 minutes. With my little commercials and my little intro skit, it bumps it up to about 46 to 50 some minutes. So when people see that your podcast has some length, and they also see that you got at least 6 to 10 podcasts already up, then it makes them take you a little more seriously. It's not like you're this new person just trying to jump in. So I do recommend recording like 6 podcasts, 6 to 10 podcasts, and uploading those first. Then come out when you do your 7th or your 11th podcast. That's when you come out and you start like, okay, here you go. Listen, guys, check it out. But definitely have a minimum of 6 podcasts already loaded to your hosting site, so people can actually say, okay, they're actually doing something. And when you do that, make sure people know when they can expect your next podcast. When is your next podcast going to drop? Is it going to be every Thursday, every Friday, every Wednesday, every Saturday? Let them know. Because if they like your podcast, they're going to want to know when the next one is. And if you have 6 to 10 podcasts up, that gives them something to listen to until you drop your next podcast. Instead of them thinking, well, is there going to be another one? When is there another one? You have to make sure that you include stuff like that. And another thing people ask is, when they do a podcast, is it good to collaborate? Yes, it's good. Now, some people want to try to automatically jump up and say, who's the big Joe Rogan, and I'm gonna get into the celebrity thing in a minute, but a lot of people want to look at people and say, oh, this is a big time podcaster. I want to collaborate with him. Just realize that a lot of them are not going to do it, because they're looking for, I'm about to say Tony Starks, but like they're looking for the Robert Downey Jr.'s, the Mike Tysons. Those are the people that they want on their show, because they can afford to pay them to be on their show. But the average people like us, we can't really afford, to call Obama and say, hey, Obama, come hit my podcast up. Let's talk. So you have to be kind of mindful about that. But I do recommend, if you're starting out a podcast, this is what I tell people. If you're starting out a podcast and somebody else is starting out a podcast, the two of you can work together in the beginning, be on each other's show, kind of help, kind of cross work together. That way you're kind of building an audience, you're kind of promoting each other, and you're sort of helping each other out. I think it is a good look, because the more people you kind of work with on podcasts, you kind of putting yourself out there more so more people can see you. So more people can know that you're putting yourself out there, that your podcast is out there. So by reaching into other people's audience is basically what you're doing. You know, they're introducing you to their audience. So you introduce them to your audience. So the more you do that, the more you can kind of help your numbers grow and your podcast can get bigger. Now, some people say, well, how do you know how many numbers you got? How do you know how many listeners you got? Well, with your hosting platform, it should offer analytics, and you need to check your analytics. Now, with Libsyn, like I told you, I use Libsyn, and with the $20 a month plan that I use, I always go through and check my analytics. It tells me how many people has downloaded my podcast every day. It also tells me what state. It tells me which podcast has been downloaded the most, which podcast has been downloaded the most this week. So you get all the information. And then even I can see every country to where people are listening to my podcast. And then also I can actually click on, you know, there's like there a map will pop. I should have showed y'all the map. I should have showed that to y'all. But a map will pop up. And if I click on that map, I can actually see how many people in that state has listened to my podcast. Then if I go down a little bit, I can actually see, you know, what city. That's why it's kind of cool, because when somebody say, yeah, man, you know, I heard you, I was listening to your podcast the other day. Yeah. I'm like, where you from? Like, yeah, I'm from this state. I can actually go into Libsyn, click on that state, and see the numbers down below and be like, you just told me a lie. But you can actually see that. You can actually see like how many people in each state, each city. And now here's the thing I want to tell you about the numbers, because here's a mistake a lot of people make. A lot of people, when they start podcasting, they want to see numbers. And like I said, I'm going to keep it 100 with you. When I first started my podcast, I think for the first season, I was getting like 1, 2, 10. And, you know, when I hit 11, I was like, what the? I was like, man, nobody's listening. And I was about to give up. But like I said, part of that too, like I told y'all in the beginning, I really didn't set my podcast up for success when I first started doing this, because I didn't really get my podcast on social media the way I should have, to where I can draw that audience to my podcast. And that was my fault. So like I said, my road to having a more successful podcast took longer than maybe some of the other people. If I would have worked my social media like I told y'all to do in the beginning, I would have had a much faster growing than what I did. I will be past where I'm at right now if I would have did that. But because I did not take that step, it took me a little longer to hit my numbers like I'm hitting now. So with that being said, you have to be mindful and don't pay attention to other people's podcasts. So let me talk to the people that, if you're thinking about doing a podcast and you want your podcast to be about self-improvement, motivational, if you want your podcast to be about, you know, basically about life and helping people, don't compare your podcast to the, I'm trying to be respectful because I don't want to knock other people's podcasts, because people talk about whatever they want to talk about. But if you don't compare your podcast numbers to somebody like T.I. or somebody like the Obamas, because people who are on a national platform, you know, they're celebrities. They already have 2 and 3 million followers, you know, because they're on TV every day. They, you know, everywhere they go is a national platform. Whereas for us, we have to work harder to get our stuff promoted. We have to work harder to get that audience. Real quick, little side note, like recently I saw this guy on YouTube, like Ryan George. Now, this is no disrespect to Ryan George. I think he has some of the most funniest videos, especially his pitch meetings and the travel guy on YouTube. But I said, you know what? I said, I really want to get my podcast, you know, I want to see if he advertised my podcast after one of his videos. So I was like, okay, well, let me reach out to his, he had on his count. You can email them basically. So anyways, long story short, I sent an email and this guy, his agent responded back really like within 15 minutes, like, hey, how's it going? I saw your email. You want Ryan to do some questions for you, do a promotion for your podcast. Send me the link so I can check it out. So they checked it out, blah, blah, blah. They liked it. And he was like, sure, he can do this. It's $12,000. So, all of us don't have 12 grand to be slinging around like that, but it's expensive. Now that was for a basically 40-second of him doing speaking in a space, speaking after one of his videos on YouTube. $12,000. For that, I can get on TV. I can do a TV commercial. Well, no, you can't. They're a little more expensive than that. But it's expensive. And a lot of celebrities have the power. A lot of the big corporations have the power. In saying that, don't try to compare your show with shows that are not of the same genre. Because to be honest with you, a lot of the drama and gossip and, let's just say hood shows, they will have an audience. So if you start comparing your stuff to them, you're going to feel like, wow, I'm talking about real life here, and they're only talking about sex and drugs, and they're being stupid. But don't compare your stuff to them, because some of that audience may listen to you and to them. But, don't focus on that, because it'll make you feel like your content is not worthy, or your content is not going to be successful. So you got to be mindful about that. You got to be conscious that stick to your content, stick to your guns. Don't feel like you have to branch off into the perverted way of doing things in order to be successful with your podcast. And like I said, that's what I'm telling y'all, the ways I made mistakes, like with my social media, my name. Like I said, I like the name of my podcast, but the truth is I picked a name that was very similar to a major corporation. So in web links on the internet, it's like a battle, and it's a tough battle, me competing against an entire web team. But it's a battle, but I enjoy it. So the other thing is, when you're doing your podcast, man, just make sure you think it through. Make sure you pay attention to who you want to be as a podcaster. What do you want to do? Before you go out and buy all of the equipment, before you go out and overspend, sit down and put together a plan of your podcast. And I seriously mean that. If you seriously want to stick with this and do it, like I said in the beginning, a lot of people who do podcasts don't last. They don't last. Some of them barely last 2 to 3 months. And I've heard some people with some decent shows, some good shows. And after 3 months, they were gone. They were gone. Because it costs money. Podcasting costs money. It's a little nickel and dime thing, but it's something you can manage. But the thing about podcasting is this, like I said, set up your social media. Your social media needs to be set up to where it identifies with the topic of your podcast. Like, what is the genre for your podcast? Set up your social media so you're actually hashtagging and reaching out to that group. Like I said, if it's self-improvement, make sure you're doing self-improvement posts. Build your Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Build it towards self-improvement, technology, music, business. Build it up so you can get people following you in that aspect. Because if they come to know you as a person who talks about music, you're going to attract a music audience. If you talk about business, you're going to attract a business audience. Also, start connecting and following people who also are doing things that you're interested in talking about. If they're interested in music and stuff like that, start following them. Here's the thing. If you're into music, don't try to go after the big names, the Beyoncés, the big name people like that. Go look for the indie artists. You will really be surprised of how these indie artists will work with you, how these indie artists will send you background information, and they're more than happy to engage with you. And they're so much easier to interact with than, these so-called A-list stars. So think about that. For your equipment, when you buy a microphone, like I said, a lot of people use the Yeti Blue. There's the Snowball. You need to figure out, do you want a USB? And for the life of me, I can't think of the name of the other microphone. But it doesn't plug into the computer. It plugs right into your equalizer. Dang it, my brain is going dead. it plugs right into your equalizer system to where you can adjust your sound levels and all that type of stuff. So make sure you find out, like, what type of microphone do you want? Do you want the Blue Yeti? Do you want the Snowball? Do you want to do a USB that plugs right into a computer? Or do you want to buy a mixer? There you go, mixer. Do you want to buy a mixer? Because now you're adding more money when you're talking about a mixer than you talk about a microphone that plugs into the mixer. So you're having to buy more stuff. And like I said, start off simple. Get your pop filter, get your microphone, get your little soundproof around your microphone. Start off simple, and then you can kind of build from there. Once you do that, like I said, get your name, get a domain name, whatever your podcast is. Once you realize that you're serious, make your podcast name a domain name. And like I said, it'll cost $7 to $8, $7 to $13 a year. Trust me, it's gonna make a difference, because you're gonna be real mad when your podcast is blowing up and somebody else owns the domain name, and then when you try to buy it, you know what I'm saying? Like, if you go to them, it's because you can buy a name that somebody owns, and people actually buy names just so people can come, just because they know somebody's gonna want to buy that name. If you have a name that you like and somebody has it and they're trying to sell it, get ready to pop off about $5,000 to $3,000, because you're going to have to pay for that name. And the more popular that name is, the more expensive it's going to be. So get your domain name, lock it down. That way it helps you to build your web presence. If you want a web page, it's best if you can name your web page after your podcast. That way you can communicate with your web page and also grows your internet presence. Next thing we talked about was hosting platforms. Look at the hosting platforms and figure out which one is better for you. Anchor is free, but like I said, with Anchor, you don't own your content. You don't own it. Anchor does. You also have to do a promotional video for Anchor. But if you're having a hard time right now, you maybe don't have the money, then yes, you can start with Anchor, and then you can transition to somebody else later, whether it be Libsyn, whether it be Stitcher, whether it be Podbean. So there's different places you can go and take your podcast to. If you need to record your podcast, I recommend Audacity, but there's other things like Studio 3, there's GarageBand. Audacity is free. I'm trying to give you the tools to get you started to where you can get great sound, great quality, and you can still put out a great product for your podcast. Now, like I said, you can use Audacity, GarageBand, you can use Studio 3. So those are some recording tools that you can download on your computer. So when you record, it records straight into there, and then you can do some editing or you can send it off. Next is post editing. Well, let's go back. Next is formatting. How do you want your podcast to go? Do you want an intro? Do you want to do a sketch? Do you want to just have a podcast where you talk for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour? How long is your podcast going to be? You need to set up a format. Like I said, my format is the same every show, but the little breaks I put in there may change. But I got my podcast intro mix. I got my little comedy sketch. Then I got a voiceover host, Melissa, who does my intro. You know, she comes in and announces, well, now we're going to get started. She does her little thing to introduce the show. And then that's when I come on. The first part of the show is 15 minutes. After the 15 minutes, there's a short little break in there. Then I do come back for 10 minutes. Then there's another short little break. Then I do the final thoughts. And the final thoughts is I just basically sum up the whole show. And then I close the show out with a either message about thank you for listening, or please join the Simply Straight Talk family and subscribe and all this. And then there's an outro song that plays out. So like I said, it all depends on you, how professional you want to sound, how engaging do you want. And always ask people to subscribe, listen, and like. Tell people where they can find your podcast. Next, we go into editing. When you go into, post editing. How do you want your audio to sound? Now, some people will record on Audacity or GarageBand or whatever they're using, and then just upload it to the platform and roll with it. But me personally, I know how to do audio editing, but I'm not a perfectionist at it. I'm not really skilled at it to the in depth to where Zelot is the one who does my audio editing after the podcast has been recorded. So he actually is very good at just listening for little crackling sounds or extensive breaks or, off sounding. Like sometimes when Angelique speaks and Melissa speaks and I speak, our volumes may be being recorded at different levels. So he can actually go in and like kind of balance it all out as much as possible. He also gives me tips on how I can help on my end in the initial recordings to make it easier. So when he gets in, that a more cleaner product is able to be produced. So I do recommend that you get editing. Like I said, the editing cost on Fiverr for the guy I use is $5, where he basically goes through and just, removes the crackling noise if there's anything like that. But the $20 one is like a full edit where they listen for mistakes. Like, say if I was doing a recording right now and I got to a part, I was like, yeah, and dog. Okay. So next we'll begin. And what he would do is he would edit out that stuff or the ums. Cause sometimes when people talk, it's like, he edits all that out if it's in there, so that is a nice, clean, straight transition between the conversations. So the listener is not hearing that or long pauses. So like I said, it's a lot. And even when I'm recording, I have to be mindful of that. So those are the things you have to consider, like your hosting platform. And then once you do your podcast and you selected a hosting platform, you're doing your post editing. Like I said, upload at least 6 to 10 episodes, 6 to 10, because you want people to see that you are on a path to create something long term versus, okay, I got one. If they see just one podcast, they're going to think you're not serious. So give them at least 6 to 10. And I think when I first did mine, I think I uploaded 6 podcasts. After I did that, before I released the 7th, I was telling them, hey, go check it out. Check out the podcast, this topic, this topic, this topic. So by the time it got to the 6th, by the time my 7th episode release of the first episode, there was already 6 on there that they can listen to. So boom, they got a new one. And then after that, they got a new one. So those are the things that you really have to be mindful about, because you don't want to just do one. Have something for them to see that you're serious. Now, like I said, when you're doing that, you also got to be mindful too of the content, especially on YouTube. You got to make sure that if your content is not child friendly or not for children, make sure you mark it as such, or your channel will get flagged. And the same thing, if you're putting it on iHeart, Spotify, Apple, it's the same thing. It's going to ask you, should your podcast be explicit? Is it suggestive dialogue? Because I have done some shows about sex in relationships, sexless relationships. And in those cases, I have to mark my podcast as being explicit with suggestive dialogue. And I even go so far as to use the TV ratings like TV 14, PG, R. The max I get is TV 14. That's the max. I don't go above that. But you need to make sure that you are labeling your podcast correct because you don't want complaints. And I like for the listener to know. A lot of people listening to podcasts, they may be driving in their car, or sometimes they may be home and they got kids around. You want them to know that you respect the fact that, hey, this episode is this. You're not going to lose a listener. They're going to appreciate that. So don't feel like labeling your podcast as explicit or suggestive dialogue is going to cost you a listener. It's not. Once you got your podcast done, you got your format, you got your equipment, you got your social media set up. Like I said, you want one social media for your podcast. Keep your personal social media separate. Now, you can still post stuff on there, but I'm telling you right now, you're going to find that the more people are going to support you are the people who come just for your podcast and your friends. So that's just real talk. But other than that, you want to make sure that your podcast is sounding the best you can make it, as professional as you can make it. And it's not hard to do. It's just going to take you be willing to work at it. Consistency. When are you going to release your podcast? When is your podcast going to drop? You need to make sure that you are clear about that people know when to expect your podcast. When is it going to be released? When is a new episode coming? Now, advertising and marketing, that's really up to you. I mean, a lot of people ignore this fact. They think just because you post something on the internet, it's going to blow up. The truth is, you can post a podcast up, and if you don't market and advertise it yourself, you'll be lucky if anybody ever listens to it. So it's very important that you take the time to make sure that you are posting regularly, at least 2 to 3 times a day on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, whatever social media you got set up for your podcast. You need to be advertising and marketing your topics, marketing your niche. Get people to constantly know that you're there, you're active, and I'll be honest, one of the best decisions I made was actually doing live stream. I think it's $24 a month, something like that. I didn't want to pay the money, but I'm a sort of a cheapskate. But the thing about it is, it has helped me to reach more people. It's because on YouTube, when you post your podcast, it's just going to be your cover. Like you see the little blue thing right there. That's what's going to show up, and that's what people are going to see. So it's not going to be an actual video unless you do something like this that's live that people can actually see, people can actually follow. So some people like to see it, but that's why you got to make your content really good and your conversations really focused and engaging, because if they're not seeing an active person, they're only seeing an image, then some people got ADD. They're going to wander off. So, but make sure you engage your audience as well as far as advertising and promoting your podcast. Because one of the things I've started doing is when I post stuff on my social media, whether it's negative or positive, I will just pick random comments and I will just come on and respond to that person with an actual video. Like, hey, thank you for your comment. Yeah, I agree with what you said. Thank you. You're right. Or, hey, I appreciate your comment. We're not on the same page, but I'll give my reason and I say why I dislike their reasoning. It's not an arguing thing. It's just more personable, because it's like, wow, he actually took the time to make a video to respond to me. Cool. So you got to do stuff like that as far as advertising and marketing. And you really just got to be consistent. Be patient. I'm sorry, I've been talking too much. Be patient and just really focus. Like I said, don't start a podcast if you're not willing to do the work. And I'm not trying to discourage anybody. I just want to be honest with you. It takes work. It takes work to actually put together a decent podcast. And my podcast is not even the best out there. There are other podcasts that are doing it far better than I am. I'm just blessed that my podcast is like blowing up. So you got to be willing to put in the work. So don't think, podcasting is something where you can just record, upload it, and all of a sudden you got hundreds of thousands of people listening to it. It took me almost 2 years to get that, but it was consistent. Every Friday, me dropping a show. And you're just gonna have to be consistent. You're just gonna have to be patient. You're gonna have some negative people out there. One of the things you're gonna find out that when your podcast does start to really grow is you're gonna start attracting more spammers. So I have to really focus now on my content because I get a lot of spam trying to post and advertise for other stupid stuff. And I take it down. I have to block it and report it. So you got to be mindful of that when you are doing a podcast and you start to grow in your podcast, you're going to have spammers trying to jump in so other people will bounce in with it. So be mindful of that. And some people say, well, do I need a website for my podcast? I would say have a website. It don't have to be an 8-page website. My website is, I want to say about 6 pages. But the reason my website is because I do motivational speaking. I write music, lyrics. I got one page that's just simply about the Simply Straight Talk show. One is a contact page. And I think the other one is where I'm just trying to promote other podcasters. So you can have one page that's all about your podcast. You don't need all that if you're not doing all that. If I wasn't doing all that, then I would just have one page where my listeners can subscribe if they want to. They can get information. They can ask questions and all that type of stuff. So I hope that I helped somebody. I hope this answered some questions. I try to give as much information as I can. Like I said, when I first started, I made a lot of mistakes. And I told you the mistake I made with my name, the mistake I made of not trying to get my audience. I didn't understand how much time had to be invested into putting together a podcast that was quality. So, those are just some of the mistakes I made, and it slowed down my growth to where I could have been where I'm at now much faster than I was. So yeah. And some people say, do I promote? Am I picky? Now that's one thing people say, like, are you picky about who you work with? I think you need to be as a podcaster, because remember, your audience is not going to connect with everybody you team up with. So if somebody wants to collaborate with you, which I'm cool with collaborating with people, but with me, it's kind of like, let me hear what you're doing. Let me hear what your podcast is about. And then I can see if we're on the same thing, if my audience is going to connect with your audience. Because if you're supported, like I was against the movies Cuties, but I can't work with a podcast that's pro Cuties unless we're on a platform to where we're sort of speaking our pros and cons, as saying that we're connected. I can't do that because we got different values, and that won't flow too well with my audience. So, because I found out that my audience is not a political audience. They want to break from it. So that's why you don't hear me do a lot of political stuff. I do mainly music, self-help. I try to promote other people, other musicians. So, and that's one thing I think that's been really helpful and a blessing. Like Tone G Music, Mike Glenning, who plays the guitar, excellent musician. So, Nayeli Abrego, and these are people that are just cool, man. I just want to support them and show love for what they're doing. So you just got to be mindful and, find people like that you can connect with, that you think are doing good things, and, you want to support what they're doing, and just support them, just because it builds a better bridge when you're trying to work with other people. So that's a big part of podcasting. Everything is not about who's going to pay you to do something. Sometimes when you go out of your way, when you just make the effort just to promote and help other people who are doing something good, it works out. Like I got Tone G. I run a promo from him on my podcast every week. Renee Armstrong with Leg Concierge Services in Atlanta. I run a promo for her every week. Now, Yeli Abrego, she has the Crossover, which is a live stream of musical theater performers, which are absolutely amazing. So whenever she does that, I always do like a little share whatever she's putting out. So And I don't expect anything back. I'm not looking for my name to be called out. It's just that I believe in what they're doing. I believe in, who these people are. Mike Lenning, Tone G. So sometimes by doing that, you're helping your own podcast, because it's not that you want something back. It's just that you want to see other people do well as well, especially if you believe in their work. So with that being said, I hope everybody have a good night. If there's no questions, I will end this. If you got a question, go ahead and drop your question, and I will answer it to the best of my ability. I definitely want to do that before I end this. So let me know if there's no questions. If there are no questions, then I wish everyone a good night, and everybody be safe. And just remember, if you do have questions that you can't think of now, you can, either leave a comment on the YouTube page. You can do it on Periscope, Facebook. If you want to, you can even go to my website. You can leave a comment there as well. And I will definitely answer any questions you got. If I didn't cover anything, I know I said a lot, but I was trying to give you the basics, but we're already an hour, almost an hour and a half in. So anything you guys got, just let me know. I'll be happy to answer your questions. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. And I will see you guys on the next go around.